How does a world die? Does it happen in a single, blinding flash of steel and fire? Or is it a slow, creeping poison, a decay that begins in the heart of a kingdom long before the walls are ever breached? What secret pact, made in the shadowed corridors of a palace in Alexandria, allowed a teenage girl to outmaneuver seasoned generals and scheming eunuchs, only to place her ancient kingdom squarely in the path of the greatest war machine the world had ever known? And how could the disorganized, volatile street mobs of that same city hold the world's greatest general, Gaius Julius Caesar himself, a virtual hostage, bringing him to the very brink of annihilation? The story of the fall of Egypt is not merely the chronicle of a queen's tragic love affair, it is the autopsy of a civilization. It is a tale of how a throne, inherited through generations of incest and fratricide, became the ultimate prize in a game played for the soul of the world, a world where the old gods of the Nile were about to be crushed under the sandals of Roman legions. This is the story of how Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, lost everything. Her inheritance was a kingdom in flames. In the year 51 before the Common Era, when Cleopatra ascended to the throne of Egypt, she did not inherit a golden paradise, but a viper's nest. The Egypt of the Ptolemies was a land of staggering contradictions. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, its fertile delta capable of feeding millions, its treasury overflowing with gold. Yet its people were starving. A series of low Nile floods had triggered widespread famine, and the streets of Alexandria, the glittering jewel of the Hellenistic world, were a tinderbox of unrest. The city was a chaotic symphony of cultures, a place where Greek philosophy collided with ancient Egyptian mysticism, and where the native Egyptian population simmered with resentment against their Macedonian Greek rulers. The Ptolemaic dynasty, for all its wealth and splendor, ruled as a foreign occupying force, clinging to power through a bloated bureaucracy and a heavy reliance on notoriously fickle mercenaries. The real power in the palace often lay not with the pharaoh, but with a shadowy cabal of courtiers, eunuchs, and ministers who saw the royal family as mere puppets for their own ambitions. Power is never given, it is only taken, and the price is always paid in the currency of betrayal. Cleopatra, barely 18 years old, was a product of this brutal system. She was not the ethereal beauty of later Roman propaganda. She was a scholar, the first of her dynasty in 3 centuries, to bother learning the Egyptian language, a shrewd politician who understood the intricate dance of power. She was also utterly ruthless. Her father, Ptolemy XII, mockingly nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, had bankrupted the kingdom to bribe Roman senators into keeping him on the throne, leaving a legacy of debt and Roman interference. To secure this precarious throne, he had decreed that Cleopatra would rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a boy of only 10. It was a formula for disaster, a lighted fuse leading directly to civil war. The court immediately split into factions. The boy king was a pawn in the hands of his powerful guardians, the eunuch Pothinus, his tutor Theodotus of Chios, and the general Achilles. They saw Cleopatra not as a co-ruler, but as an obstacle to be removed. They systematically worked to undermine her authority, turning the court and the Alexandrian mob against her. The whispers in the palace corridors became plots. The political maneuvering escalated into open hostility. Pothinus, the true power behind the child king, saw in Cleopatra a mind far too sharp, an ambition far too vast for him to control. He orchestrated a campaign to strip her of her titles and power, using the famine to stoke public anger against her. Street riots, conveniently timed and expertly guided, called for her removal. She was accused of hoarding grain, of sympathizing with Rome, of being an arrogant woman who dared to rule alone. In the cutthroat world of the Ptolemaic court, there was no room for a shared throne. You either ruled absolutely, or you died. Cleopatra understood this better than anyone. Faced with a conspiracy that had turned the palace into a death trap and the city into a hostile mob, she made a choice that defined her reign. She fled. But she did not flee into obscurity. She fled east, towards the Roman province of Syria, to do the one thing a cornered monarch can do, raise an army. Her exile was not a period of mourning, it was a masterclass in statecraft and logistics. While her brother and his handlers celebrated their victory in Alexandria, Cleopatra was mustering forces, forging alliances with local Arab chieftains, and securing funding from any source she could find. She was transforming herself from a fugitive queen into a credible military threat, camped on the eastern border of Egypt, preparing to reclaim her birthright by force. The stage was set for a squalid and bloody civil war between siblings, a conflict that would have likely bled Egypt dry and been forgotten by history had it not been for the sudden and dramatic arrival of an outside force. Rome, the ever-present shadow looming over the Mediterranean, was in the throes of its own cataclysmic civil war, and its victor, the most powerful man in the world, was sailing towards Egypt in pursuit of his defeated rival. That man was Gaius Julius Caesar, and his arrival would turn a local power struggle into a geopolitical firestorm. The war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra was about to become a footnote in a much larger story. As her mercenary army faced off against her brother's forces near the fortress of Pelusium, the fate of Egypt was no longer in their hands. It was being decided hundreds of miles away on the plains of Pharsalus in Greece, where Caesar's legions shattered the armies of his great rival, Pompey the Great. Pompey, stripped of his army and his dignity, fled for the only sanctuary he could think of, Egypt. He believed the young King Ptolemy, whose father he had supported, owed him a debt of gratitude. It was a fatal miscalculation. Pothinus and his council saw not a supplicant, but a problem. Granting Pompey sanctuary would earn them the eternal enmity of Caesar. Refusing him would be an insult. So they chose a third, more brutal option. As Pompey's boat neared the shore, he was met not by a welcoming party, but by assassins. He was stabbed to death, his head severed and his body left on the beach, a gruesome offering intended to curry favor with the approaching victor. They had profoundly misjudged their man. When Julius Caesar landed in Alexandria a few days later, he was presented with Pompey's head as a gift. He reacted not with gratitude, but with disgust and fury. Pompey had been his rival, his son-in-law, and a great Roman. To have him murdered so ignominiously by a cabal of palace schemers was an insult to the majesty of Rome itself. Caesar, accompanied by a small force of less than 4,000 legionaries, established himself in the royal palace and declared his intention to arbitrate the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. He was not just a general, he was the embodiment of Roman authority. He demanded the massive sums of money Cleopatra's father had promised him and made it clear that he, and he alone, would decide who ruled Egypt. This arrogance, this casual assertion of dominance, was a spark in the gunpowder-filled streets of Alexandria. The king's army, led by the general Achilles and numbering some 20,000 men, saw a golden opportunity. The great Caesar had walked into a trap. The situation was a paradox of power. Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul and the master of the Roman world, found himself besieged in the royal quarter of Alexandria by an Egyptian army and an enraged populace. Pothinus and Achilles, believing they had the upper hand, launched an all-out assault. The Alexandrian War had begun. What followed was months of brutal close-quarters street fighting, a kind of warfare for which the Roman legions were ill-suited. The Alexandrians were masters of their labyrinthine city. They barricaded streets, rained projectiles from rooftops, and used their control of the canals to cut off Caesar's water supply. The Roman garrison was isolated, outnumbered 5-1, and fighting for its very survival. It was in this desperate, claustrophobic environment that Cleopatra made her legendary move. Smuggled out of the city, she understood that her only path back to the throne was through Caesar. If she could not reach him, she would be irrelevant. The story has been told for 2 millennia, a testament to its theatrical genius. Unable to enter the besieged palace through conventional means, Cleopatra had herself rolled up in a carpet, or, according to some sources, a humble bed sack, and carried through enemy lines as cargo. She was delivered directly to Caesar's private chambers, When the bundle was unrolled, the 21-year-old queen emerged, a living, breathing gambit. This was not merely the act of a seductress, it was a move of breathtaking political audacity. She bypassed the guards, the ministers, and the protocol, presenting herself directly to the only man whose opinion mattered. She was betting her life, her crown, and the future of Egypt on the force of her own personality and the strength of her arguments. She offered Caesar what he desperately needed: a legitimate local ally, a claim to the throne, and, most importantly, access to the vast wealth of the Ptolemies to fund his wars and pay his troops. In that moment, surrounded by the sounds of battle, a partnership was forged not in a lover's embrace, but in the cold calculus of mutual survival. A cage of gold is still a cage, especially when the bars are forged from your own ambition. Their alliance immediately changed the dynamic of the war. Caesar now had a claimant to the throne inside the palace with him, lending legitimacy to his intervention, but it also enraged the faction of Ptolemy XIII even further. The fighting intensified. During one naval skirmish in the harbour, fires set by Roman troops spread to the docks and, tragically, to a warehouse containing scrolls from the Great Library of Alexandria, a catastrophic loss of ancient knowledge. Caesar himself was forced to swim for his life, holding his precious commentaries above the water with one hand while dodging enemy arrows. He was pushed to the very limit of his military genius, forced to use every trick and stratagem to keep his small force from being overwhelmed. The conflict culminated in the Battle of the Nile, where Roman reinforcements finally arrived and smashed the Egyptian army. Ptolemy XIII, attempting to flee, was drowned in the river, his golden armor weighing him down. The war was over. Caesar was victorious. And Cleopatra, thanks to her daring gamble and his legions, was the undisputed Queen of Egypt. What would you risk for a throne, your honor or your life? Tell us in the comments what you would put on the line. With her troublesome brother dead, Cleopatra's throne was secure, but her kingdom was now, for all intents and purposes, a Roman protectorate. Caesar, however, did not annex Egypt. He understood its immense wealth and strategic importance were best managed through a loyal client ruler. He left 3 legions in Alexandria to secure his interests and to ensure the queen's loyalty, and then embarked on a tour of the Nile with Cleopatra. This famous journey was both a victory lap and a political statement. Sailing up the river on a magnificent royal barge, they displayed their combined power to the Egyptian people, reinforcing her status as pharaoh and his as the ultimate arbiter of that power. It was during this time that their relationship deepened. For Caesar, the aging statesman and general, Cleopatra was more than just a beautiful and intelligent woman. She was the key to the East, a living embodiment of the ancient, wealthy world he sought to control. For Cleopatra, Caesar was her protector, her champion, and the father of her child. She soon gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Caesar, better known to history as Caesarion, Little Caesar. His birth was a momentous event, a union of the Roman eagle and the Egyptian cobra, a potential heir to 2 worlds. This new stability allowed Cleopatra to finally govern her kingdom. She proved to be a capable and effective ruler. She tackled the economic crisis, reformed the administration, and worked to stabilize the currency. Unlike her predecessors, she engaged with the native Egyptian priesthood and populace, participating in their religious ceremonies and presenting herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis. This was a savvy political move, shoring up her support beyond the fractious Greek elite of Alexandria. She was not just a Greek queen, she was a pharaoh, but her ambitions extended far beyond the banks of the Nile. Her ultimate security, and that of her son, depended on Caesar's position in Rome. When Caesar finally departed Egypt to continue consolidating his power across the Roman world, it was not a final goodbye. He summoned her to Rome, a move that would elevate her to the pinnacle of international influence, but also place her at the very center of a new and far more dangerous political storm. Rome was not Alexandria. Its politics were a different kind of lethal. In the year 46 before the Common Era, Cleopatra arrived in Rome. She did not come as a conquered vassal, but as a triumphant allied queen, the guest of the dictator himself. She was housed in one of Caesar's luxurious villas across the Tiber, where she established a lavish court that became the talk of the city. Her presence was a spectacle. Romans, accustomed to a certain republican austerity, were both fascinated and scandalized by her exotic retinue, her immense wealth, and her regal bearing. She was a living symbol of the East, a world of absolute monarchs and divine rulers that was deeply antithetical to Roman values. For the Roman aristocracy, she was an object of suspicion and contempt. They saw her not as a sovereign ally, but as Caesar's foreign mistress, a corrupting influence on their great leader. The great orator Cicero, a bastion of old republican values, seethed in his letters, writing, "I detest the queen." He saw her arrogance and her influence as a grave threat to the republic. The heart of their fear, however, was not Cleopatra herself, but her son Caesarion. In him, the Roman Senate saw the terrifying spectre of a dynasty. Caesar was already dictator for life, a king in all but name. If he were to officially recognize Caesarion as his son and heir, it would signal the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of a Hellenistic-style monarchy. The very idea was anathema. Rome built its identity on the rejection of kings. To have a half-Egyptian boy, the son of a foreign queen, potentially inherit the legacy of Rome was an unthinkable horror for the conservative elite. Cleopatra's presence in the city, her regal confidence, and her undeniable closeness to Caesar poured fuel on the fires of conspiracy. Every honor Caesar bestowed upon her, he even had a golden statue of her placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the mythical ancestor of his own family, was seen as another nail in the coffin of the Republic. She became a lightning rod for all the resentment and fear that Caesar's absolute power had generated. Rome built roads and laws, while Egypt built illusions. But in the end, the world always chooses what you can walk on, not what you can believe in. While Cleopatra held court in her villa, a conspiracy was taking shape in the shadows of the Senate house. Men like Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, men who had once been Caesar's enemies and had been pardoned by him, began to whisper of tyranny. They believed Caesar intended to declare himself king and move the capital of the Roman world from the Tiber to Alexandria, making Cleopatra his queen. These fears were not entirely baseless. Caesar was openly flirting with the symbols of monarchy, and his relationship with the Egyptian queen seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. Cleopatra, for her part, likely underestimated the depth of Roman republican sentiment. In her world, power was dynastic, divine, and absolute. The Roman obsession with titles, traditions, and the appearance of collective rule must have seemed a quaint but dangerous absurdity. She was playing an old game by old rules in a city that was ruthlessly inventing new ones. The tension in Rome became unbearable. Omens and prophecies of doom were whispered throughout the city. Caesar was warned repeatedly that his life was in danger, but he was a man who had gambled and won against impossible odds his entire life. He had faced down Gallic hordes, defied the Senate, crossed the Rubicon, and survived the Alexandrian death trap. He had come to believe himself invincible, more than a man, a god in the making. He dismissed the warnings, convinced that his destiny was still unfulfilled. The conspirators, calling themselves the Liberators, saw their window of opportunity closing. They set a date for their desperate act, the Ides of March, the 15th of the month, in the year 44 before the Common Era. On that day, as Julius Caesar entered a meeting of the Senate, he was surrounded by a group of senators, his supposed friends and colleagues. They drew daggers hidden in their togas and fell upon him. He was stabbed 23 times, falling dead at the foot of a statue of his old rival Pompey. The greatest man in the world was dead, and with his death, Cleopatra's world, her security, and all her ambitions came crashing down in a single bloody moment. The assassination of Julius Caesar plunged Rome into chaos. The Liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, had no plan beyond the murder itself. They had naively believed that killing the tyrant would magically restore the Republic. Instead, they unleashed a new and even more terrifying wave of civil war. The city was gripped by panic and violence. Caesar's loyal legions, under the command of his top lieutenant, Mark Antony, were enraged. The common people, who had adored Caesar, rioted in the streets, hunting down the assassins. For Cleopatra, the situation was catastrophic. Her only protector, the foundation of her power, was gone. Overnight, she transformed from a celebrated allied queen into a vulnerable foreigner, the hated mistress of a dead dictator, trapped in a city baying for blood. Her life and the life of her son Caesarion were in immediate danger. She was a target for every faction, for the liberators who despised her, and for Caesar's heirs who saw her son as a rival to their own claims. Her escape from Rome was a desperate, hurried affair. Stripped of her protector and her influence, she gathered her household and her child and fled the city, making her way back to the relative safety of Egypt. Her grand Roman dream was over, shattered on the floor of the Senate House. She returned to a kingdom that was still hers, but her position in the wider world was now dangerously uncertain. The Roman world had fractured. On one side were the assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who fled east to raise armies in the provinces. On the other side were Caesar's avengers, led by two men, Mark Antony, his charismatic and battle-hardened general, and Gaius Octavian, Caesar's young, sickly, and previously unknown grandnephew, whom Caesar had secretly adopted as his son and heir in his will. These two men, initially allies in their quest to hunt down the assassins, were destined to become bitter rivals in the struggle for Caesar's ultimate prize, supreme power over the Roman world. Cleopatra, watching from Alexandria, knew she would have to choose a side. The survival of Egypt depended on backing the right horse in this new, brutal Roman race. The world had become a chessboard, and every piece was a predator. For the next few years, Cleopatra played a cautious game. She consolidated her rule in Egypt, dealing with another bout of famine and maintaining a careful neutrality as the Roman civil war raged. She quietly supported the Caesarian faction, sending them funds and resources, but avoided any direct military commitment. The war reached its climax at the Battle of Philippi in Greece, where the combined forces of Antony and Octavian decisively crushed the armies of Brutus and Cassius. Both assassins committed suicide, and the last vestiges of the old republic died with them. The victors now divided the Roman world between them. Octavian, the shrewd politician, took control of the troublesome West, including Rome itself. Antony, the soldier and bon vivant, took the wealthy and glamorous East. This division placed Mark Antony directly on Cleopatra's doorstep. He was now the most powerful Roman in her part of the world, and he needed Egypt's money, grain, and resources to govern his vast new territories and reward his legions. It was inevitable that their paths would cross. Antony needed answers. He wanted to know why the Queen of Egypt had not offered more enthusiastic support in his war against the assassins. He summoned her to meet him at Tarsus in modern-day Turkey to explain herself. What would you do in her position, facing the man who held your kingdom's fate in his hands? Would you offer submission, hoping for mercy, or would you attempt a bold gambit, risking everything on a single display of power? Share your strategy in the comments. The summons was a test, a power play. Antony intended to intimidate the queen, to demand an accounting and, most likely, to extort a fortune from her. He expected a nervous vassal to arrive, ready to beg for his favor. Cleopatra, however, had no intention of playing the part of a supplicant. She had learned from her time with Caesar that with men like these, a display of weakness was fatal. She decided not to just answer the summons, but to transform it into a spectacle of such overwhelming power and allure that Antony would be the one left breathless. She delayed her arrival, building his anticipation and his irritation. Then she made her entrance. She sailed up the river Cydnus to Tarsus not in a warship, but in a magnificent barge with a gilded stern, purple sails, and silver oars that beat time to the music of flutes and lyres. She herself was reclining on a canopied deck, dressed in the robes of the goddess Venus, or Aphrodite as the Greeks knew her, attended by servants dressed as cupids and sea nymphs. The entire city of Tarsus emptied out to witness the spectacle, leaving Antony sitting alone on his tribunal. He had summoned a queen for an interrogation. A goddess had arrived for a festival. This was not simply seduction, it was political theatre of the highest order. It was a calculated demonstration of wealth, culture, and divine authority. She was showing Antony that she was not just some minor client ruler he could bully. She was the heir to a civilization, a living goddess, and most importantly, she controlled the resources he so desperately needed. That evening, she invited him to a banquet aboard her ship, a feast of such opulence and extravagance that it stunned the Roman general and his staff. In a single, masterful performance, Cleopatra had completely flipped the script. She had seized the initiative, meeting Antony not as a subordinate, but as an equal, and dazzling him with a vision of the power and pleasure the East could offer. Antony, a man known for his appetites, for battle, for wine, for women, for glory, was utterly captivated. He was a brilliant soldier but a far less subtle politician than his rival Octavian. He was a man who appreciated grand gestures, and Cleopatra's was the grandest he had ever seen. The interrogation was forgotten, a partnership was born. Their alliance was both a passionate romance and a pragmatic political project. For Antony, Cleopatra was the key to unlocking the riches of the East, the financial backing he needed to rival Octavian and to fund his planned grand campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's great enemy, on its eastern frontier. For Cleopatra, Antony was her new Roman protector, a military powerhouse who could guarantee her throne and the future of her son, Caesarion. Together they represented a fusion of Roman military might and Egyptian wealth, a potent combination that could potentially create a new kind of empire, a Romano-Egyptian dynasty that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean. They spent the winter of 41 to 40 before the Common Era together in Alexandria, a season of legendary excess and indulgence. They formed a society of inimitable livers, holding lavish banquets and engaging in elaborate games and pranks. But beneath the revelry, they were laying the foundations of their shared power. Cleopatra was solidifying her position, and Antony was being drawn deeper into the world of Hellenistic monarchy, a world of luxury and absolute authority that was dangerously seductive for a Roman general. This partnership began to immediately reshape the political map. Antony, with Cleopatra's support, acted as the supreme ruler of the East. He settled disputes, deposed and installed client kings, and reorganized provinces. He was behaving less like a Roman proconsul and more like an emperor. Cleopatra, in turn, regained territories that had once belonged to the Ptolemaic Empire, including parts of Syria and Cyprus. Their joint power was growing at an astonishing rate. Cleopatra bore Antony twins, a boy named Alexander Helios and a girl named Cleopatra Selene. The message was clear: this was not a temporary affair, it was the foundation of a new dynasty. But this burgeoning Eastern Empire presented a direct challenge to Antony's co-ruler in Rome. Octavian, watching from across the sea, saw every move Antony made not as the action of a Roman general securing the provinces, but as a betrayal, a slide into Oriental decadence orchestrated by a foreign queen. Ambition is a fire that, left unchecked, consumes not only its owner but the entire world around them. The partnership between Antony and Cleopatra was such a fire, and it was about to set the world ablaze. The delicate balance of power in the Roman world could not last. While Antony was living in splendor in Alexandria, Octavian was in Italy, fighting political battles in the Senate and dealing with famines, land confiscations, and a disgruntled populace. He was building his power base brick by brick, presenting himself as the sober, hard-working champion of Roman tradition, in stark contrast to the decadent, orientalized Antony. The two men were on a collision course. A temporary truce was patched up, forcing Antony to return to Rome and to seal the deal by marrying Octavian's virtuous and respected sister, Octavia. For a time, it seemed that peace might hold. Antony left a pregnant Cleopatra in Egypt and tried to play the part of a Roman statesman. But the pull of the East and the pull of the Queen was too strong. His military ambitions against Parthia required Egyptian funding, and his heart, it seemed, was in Alexandria. He eventually abandoned Octavia, his Roman wife, and returned to Cleopatra. This was a personal insult that Octavian would never forgive, and a powerful propaganda tool he would use to devastating effect. The final break came in the year 34, before the Common Era. After a moderately successful military campaign in Armenia, Antony staged a bizarre and provocative ceremony in Alexandria. It has become known to history as the Donations of Alexandria. Instead of celebrating a traditional Roman triumph, he held a grand Hellenistic-style celebration in the city's gymnasium. He and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones raised on a silver platform, dressed as the gods Dionysus and Isis. Their children were seated on smaller thrones beside them. What happened next was a political earthquake that sent shockwaves all the way to Rome. Antony publicly declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and confirmed Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, as Caesar's true and legitimate heir. This was a direct challenge to Octavian, whose entire claim to power was based on his status as Caesar's adopted son. But Antony did not stop there. He then donated huge swathes of Roman and allied territory to Cleopatra and their children. Their son, Alexander Helios, was named ruler of Armenia and Parthia, which Antony had not yet even conquered. His twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, was given Cyrenaica and Libya, and their youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was granted Syria and Cilicia. For the people in Alexandria, it was a magnificent spectacle, the declaration of a glorious new Eastern Empire, a restoration of Ptolemaic power. But in Rome, the news of the donations was received with absolute fury. It was seen as the ultimate act of treason. Antony, a Roman general, had given away Roman land to a foreign queen and her illegitimate children. He had snubbed Roman tradition, celebrated a foreign-style triumph, and publicly declared Caesar's biological son as the true heir, effectively nullifying Octavian's entire existence. He had also implicitly suggested that the center of power was no longer Rome, but Alexandria. Octavian, a master of political theater himself, seized on this act as the ultimate justification for war. He now had the perfect pretext to paint Antony not as a political rival, but as an enemy of the state, a man so enthralled by an evil foreign sorceress that he had betrayed his country. The donations of Alexandria were not just a political blunder, they were a declaration of war written in golden arrogance. A single moment of hubris can undo a lifetime of victories. Octavian immediately launched one of the most effective and vicious propaganda campaigns in history. The war for the soul of the Roman world would be fought first not with swords, but with words. He and his supporters unleashed a torrent of slander and misinformation aimed at Antony, but its true target was Cleopatra. She was portrayed as a decadent, power-hungry foreign witch who used sex and magic to enslave the noble Roman general. She was the Egyptian whore, a serpent who planned to destroy Rome and rule the world from Alexandria. This was a carefully crafted campaign of xenophobia and misogyny designed to tap into the deepest fears of the Roman people. Pamphlets, satirical poems, and inflammatory speeches depicted Antony as a drunken, emasculated puppet, dressing in foreign costumes and participating in bizarre Eastern religious rites. He was no longer a Roman, the propaganda screamed, but a traitor who had gone native. Every decision he made was spun as proof of his enslavement to the queen. The campaign was relentless and brilliant. Octavian's agents worked tirelessly to spread these stories throughout Italy and the western provinces. They painted a picture of a stark choice, the traditional, masculine, Roman virtue of Octavian versus the corrupt, effeminate foreign decadence of Antony and his queen. The narrative was simple, powerful, and effective. It transformed a political power struggle into a clash of civilizations, a defense of Rome itself against a monstrous foreign threat. The truth of the matter, that this was a civil war between two Roman warlords for ultimate power, was skillfully buried under an avalanche of character assassination. Cleopatra was the perfect villain for Octavian's story. She was a woman, a foreigner, and a monarch, three things that triggered suspicion and hostility in the Roman psyche. An army can conquer a city, but a well-told lie can conquer the world. Octavian's lies were conquering the hearts and minds of the Roman people, isolating Antony and making war not just possible, but popular. The climax of this propaganda war came with a masterful act of political espionage and theatre. Octavian's agents managed to get their hands on Antony's will, which had been deposited for safekeeping with the Vestal Virgins in Rome. In a move of dubious legality but political genius, Octavian seized the will and read its contents aloud to the Senate. Whether the document was authentic or partially forged is still debated by historians, but its effect was explosive. According to the will, Antony reaffirmed the donations of Alexandria, recognizing Caesarion as Caesar's heir and granting kingdoms to his own children by Cleopatra. Most damningly of all, it stipulated that should he die in Rome, his body was to be shipped back to Alexandria to be buried beside his queen. This was the final straw. For the Senate and people of Rome, this was irrefutable proof that Antony had turned his back on his homeland. The request for a foreign burial was seen as the ultimate betrayal, a severing of his very identity as a Roman. The outrage was universal. The Senate, whipped into a frenzy by Octavian's rhetoric, officially revoked Antony's powers and declared war. But in a clever legalistic move, they did not declare war on Antony himself. To do so would be to officially acknowledge another civil war. Instead, they declared war on Cleopatra. This masterstroke allowed Octavian to frame the coming conflict not as Romans fighting Romans, but as the Roman Republic fighting a just war against a foreign enemy. Antony, by choosing to stand with her, would automatically become a traitor. The war of words was over. Octavian had won it decisively. He had successfully isolated his rival, unified public opinion behind him, and secured the legal and moral authority for the final bloody confrontation. The fleets were gathering, the legions were marching. The fate of the world would now be decided not in the Forum, but on the waves of the Ionian Sea. In the year 31 before the Common Era, the two largest fleets the world had ever seen converged on the west coast of Greece, near a promontory called Actium. This was to be the decisive battle, the final act in the long drama of the Roman civil wars. On one side was the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra, a massive armada of some 500 ships. Many of these were gigantic warships, quinqueremes and octeres, floating fortresses with bronze rams and towers filled with archers. On the other side was the fleet of Octavian, commanded by his brilliant and innovative admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa's fleet was smaller, consisting of around 400 ships, but they were a different kind of vessel. They were lighter, more maneuverable Liburnians, designed for speed and agility rather than brute force. The stage was set for a cataclysmic naval clash. Antony's forces were formidable. He had more ships, more soldiers, and seasoned veterans. On paper, he should have had the advantage, but his command was plagued by problems. Sickness had swept through his camps, and more critically, a wave of defections had begun as Roman officers, uneasy about fighting for a foreign queen against their countrymen, switched their allegiance to Octavian. The battle itself, when it finally began on the 2nd of September, was a strange and anticlimactic disaster for Antony. For hours, the two fleets faced off, with Antony's larger ships proving difficult for Agrippa's lighter vessels to damage. But Agrippa was a master strategist. He used his more nimble ships to outmaneuver Antony's heavyweights, swarming them, attacking their rudders and oars, and using projectile weapons to clear their decks. The battle was turning into a chaotic, grinding affair when the unthinkable happened. Cleopatra, commanding her own squadron of 60 Egyptian warships, suddenly broke from the line of battle and sailed south, away from the fighting. Was this a pre-arranged escape plan, a signal for a strategic withdrawal? Or was it a moment of sheer panic, a sudden loss of nerve in the face of the brutal reality of war? Historians have debated this question for centuries. The true motive for her flight remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. What followed is even more inexplicable. Mark Antony, seeing Cleopatra's ships fleeing, seemed to lose his will to fight. He abandoned his massive flagship, transferred to a smaller, faster vessel, and sailed after her, leaving his entire fleet and his legions on the shore to fend for themselves. The commander had deserted his army in the middle of their most important battle. The effect on his forces was devastating. Morale collapsed. Some ships fought on bravely, but without leadership and a coherent strategy. They were picked off one by Agrippa's relentless fleet. Others simply surrendered. By the end of the day, Antony's magnificent armada was a burning, sinking wreck. His land army, which had watched the naval catastrophe unfold from the shore, held out for a week before surrendering to Octavian. In a single afternoon, Antony and Cleopatra had lost everything. Their fleet was gone, their army was gone, and their cause was irrevocably broken. Actium was not just a defeat, it was a complete and utter rout, a military and psychological catastrophe from which there could be no recovery. The war was effectively over. All that remained was for the victor to chase down the vanquished. One fatal choice can unravel an empire. Whose choice at Actium was more disastrous, Cleopatra's decision to flee or Antony's decision to follow? Let us know in the comments. The flight from Actium was a journey of shame and despair. Antony and Cleopatra made their way back to Alexandria, the beaten and broken leaders of a lost cause. Antony fell into a deep depression, building a solitary retreat by the harbor where he brooded over his monumental failure, shunning even Cleopatra's company. The queen, however, was ever the pragmatist. She knew Octavian's legions would be coming for them, and she began to make desperate, fantastical plans for escape. She considered a scheme to drag her remaining ships over the desert to the Red Sea, to flee to India or some other distant land. She even began testing various poisons on prisoners, seeking a quick and painless death should the worst come to pass. But there was no escape. Octavian was methodical and relentless. His legions advanced on Egypt from both the east and the west, methodically picking off the garrisons and client kingdoms still loyal to Antony. The net was closing. As Octavian's armies reached the outskirts of Alexandria in the summer of the year 30 before the Common Era, Antony was stirred from his stupor to make one last desperate stand. He led his remaining cavalry in a surprisingly successful skirmish against Octavian's vanguard, a final, fleeting flash of his old military brilliance. But it was a hollow victory. The next day, when he prepared for a major battle, his remaining fleet and cavalry deserted him, defecting to Octavian. The final betrayal broke him completely. At that moment, a false rumor, perhaps started by Cleopatra herself, in a desperate attempt to test his loyalty or simply to avoid his wrath, reached him. The queen was dead. Believing everything he had fought for was gone, Antony decided to end his own life. He asked his servant Eros to kill him, but the loyal servant killed himself instead. Shamed by this act of devotion, Antony fell on his own sword. The wound, however, was not immediately fatal. In agony, he learned that the queen was, in fact, still alive. She had barricaded herself with her most trusted servants and her vast treasure inside her mausoleum, a monumental tomb she had built for herself. Antony, bleeding and dying, had his men carry him to the tomb. Because the doors were sealed, Cleopatra and her attendants had to use ropes to hoist his broken body up the walls and through a high window. He died in her arms, a tragic and ignominious end for the man who had once been Caesar's right hand and the master of half the Roman world. Soon after, Octavian's soldiers stormed the city. One of his commanders managed to trick his way into the mausoleum and captured Cleopatra. The last queen of Egypt, the descendant of Alexander the Great, was now a prisoner of the cold, calculating son of a provincial moneylender. The final confrontation, the one that would determine the fate of her life and her legacy, was at hand. The tragedy of power is not in losing it, but in surviving long enough to see what replaces you. The meeting between Cleopatra and Octavian was the final clash of two worlds. She was in her late 30s, a queen who had commanded armies, captivated the two most powerful men of her age, and ruled a kingdom for 2 decades. He was a young man in his early 30s, physically unimposing, but possessing an iron will and a genius for cold, pragmatic politics. Cleopatra, though a prisoner, attempted one last gamble. She tried to use the charisma and intellect that had worked on Caesar and Antony. She appeared before Octavian, dressed modestly, trying to elicit his pity while also arguing for her kingdom to be preserved for her children. But Octavian was immune to her charms. He was not a man of passion like Antony, he was a creature of pure, calculating ambition. He listened politely, but his mind was already made up. He offered her vague assurances of her safety, but his true intentions were clear. She was the ultimate prize of his victory, the great enemy he had vanquished. He intended to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumph, a living symbol of his absolute power, the foreign queen in golden chains for all the world to see. For Cleopatra, this was a fate worse than death. To be publicly humiliated, to be a spectacle for the Roman mob, was an unbearable thought for a woman who had lived her entire life as a goddess and a queen. She understood that there was no hope for her dynasty, no future for her children in a world ruled by Octavian. She made her final choice. She asked for and was granted permission to pay her last respects at Antony's tomb. After a final banquet, she wrote a letter to Octavian and had it delivered. When he read it, he understood from her words what she intended to do and sent guards rushing to her mausoleum. But they were too late. They found the queen dead on her golden bed, dressed in her royal robes, with one of her handmaidens dying at her feet and another adjusting her mistress's diadem. According to the legend that has echoed through the centuries, she had died from the bite of an asp, a sacred Egyptian cobra, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. It was a perfectly theatrical end, a death befitting an Egyptian pharaoh. Octavian was reportedly furious that she had escaped him, but he was also a pragmatist. He gave her a royal burial, placing her beside Antony in the mausoleum. Then he systematically erased the last vestiges of her legacy. He had her eldest son, Caesarion, the boy who was a living threat to his claim as Caesar's heir, hunted down and executed. "Two Caesars are one too many," he is said to have remarked. Antony's other children by Cleopatra were spared and sent to Rome to be raised by his abandoned wife, Octavia. Egypt, the ancient kingdom of the pharaohs, was no more. It was not made a regular Roman province, but was declared the personal property of Octavian and his successors, its immense wealth now flowing directly into the emperor's private treasury. The fall of Egypt was complete. The 300-year-old Ptolemaic dynasty was wiped from the face of the earth. The Hellenistic age, which had begun with the conquests of Alexander, had finally ended. In its place, a new era was dawning. The age of the Roman Empire, founded on the ashes of Alexandria and ruled by the man who would soon be known to the world as Augustus. History is written by the victors. Octavian, now the undisputed master of the Roman world, cemented his version of events. Cleopatra became a cautionary tale, a wicked foreign seductress who had almost brought down Rome. But in her final defiant act, she had written her own legend. By choosing the moment and manner of her death, she had denied Octavian his ultimate triumph and transformed herself from a defeated queen into an immortal symbol of resistance. She became a myth, a figure of romance, tragedy, and power who would fascinate artists, writers, and poets for the next 2,000 years. The Roman Empire that Octavian founded would last for centuries, shaping the course of Western civilization. But in the end, empires fall. Octavian built an empire of stone and law, while Cleopatra, in her death, secured an empire of the imagination. Tell us what ultimately proved to be stronger, the iron power of Octavian, who built an empire that ruled for 1,000 years, or the immortal legend of Cleopatra, who continues to conquer our imaginations to this day? Write your answer in the comments. History is a debate, and your voice matters. Now that the complete narrative of the fall of Egypt is finished, would you like me to generate a concise summary of the key events, or perhaps create a list of the primary historical sources used in this account for further reading?